Welcome back, everyone. And thank you to everybody who sent me the stunning pictures that you took of the amazing ambiance after last week, the beautiful setting in which we live. I got to see some gorgeous sunsets, some interesting cloud formations, and also the beautiful varied colors of the leaves in autumn. That's fall for the Americans. And I hope that over the last week, you were able to appreciate and feel gratitude and gain joy from just those little extras, the little extras that we don't need. This week, Joy and Gratitude has been sponsored in the memory of Moshe Yaakov ben Yosef Baruch, whose Yortzeit was this week. May the learning and any joy experience from it be an aliyah for his neshama. So it's almost Hanukkah. And as everyone knows, Hanukkah means presents, right? Hanukkah means presents. And we all get excited when we get some presents, not just children. Imagine if we were to get to open 2 presents every single day. Wouldn't that be amazing, right? And yeah, that is exactly what we do, because we open our eyes every morning. Now, if you remember a couple of months ago, we were talking about the blessing of Asher Yatsa that we say after the bathroom, and we talked about appreciating different aspects of health. So a few people have contacted me recently to say that they've run out of ideas. I was saying, you know, each time you say that blessing, it's an opportunity to thank and be grateful for a different aspect of your body, a different aspect of health. So yes, a few people have said that, you know, they've been doing it all of this time, but they've run out of ideas. So I think it's time to revisit this idea and perhaps look into more detail so that we can appreciate and be grateful even for the minute details. But in order to do that, we need to learn a little bit of anatomy. And as I'm an optometrist, it makes sense for me to talk about the eye. So I apologize in advance if you don't like this sort of stuff, or perhaps you're a little bit squeamish. But in reality, to be truly grateful for our bodies, we need to have an understanding of biology. We need to understand how things work. So here we go. The eye is a tremendously complex and truly amazing organ. I would sit in university in my lectures, and I would have professors, top professors, who were all avowed atheists. And they would stand there and lecture me in Niflaot Habore, which means the wonders of the Creator. And I would just sit there, just smiling and just loving every single moment, because it is truly unbelievable. So you'll have to excuse me if I get a little bit excited about this. It's like, you know, it's been a part of my life for the last 20 years. But I'd like to share some of that unbelievable joy you get from understanding how things work and how perfectly they work. So let's start at the front of the eye. In order to see, light needs to get through to the back of the eye. And therefore, what it passes through has to be transparent. Just think for a moment, just that itself should already be something that we need to appreciate. I mean, there's no other external organ of the body that is transparent. In order for it to be transparent, the cells of the cornea, the cells of that part of the eye, need to be perfectly aligned. If they're different sizes or they're placed haphazardly, it will make the cornea opaque. So those cells of the cornea are perfectly aligned so that the light doesn't scatter. But that's not good enough. All parts of the body need oxygen in order to survive. And the different parts of our body get oxygen from the blood supply. Yeah, we talked about that in a previous week. But there's a problem for the cornea, because if blood vessels went through the cornea, that would force the cells to not perfectly be aligned. And it would create areas of distortion and opaqueness. So the light wouldn't be able to get through. And therefore, instead of getting oxygen from a blood supply, the cornea gets its oxygen direct from the air. But how does it do that? Well, the oxygen needs to dissolve in water, and only once it's dissolved in water can it then filter through into the eye through something called diffusion. So we have a layer of tear film. No, I'm not talking about when we're crying, just a constant layer of liquid covering our eyes so that the oxygen in the air can dissolve in it and it can then filter through into the cornea. Our eye needs to be kept moist the whole time. But the tear film doesn't just do that. The tear film makes the surface of the cornea even more smooth. It covers up any slight imperfections. And also without it, the cells of the cornea would dry out and they would begin to go out of shape. And then again, the cornea would lose its transparency. So we've got this thin layer of liquid that covers our eye. It can't be too much because then it would overflow and we'd be crying all the time, or it would blur our vision, like when we're getting emotional, and then we won't be able to see anything. So it has to be a very, very thin layer of liquid. And every time we blink, we wash over a thin layer of liquid. Now, what's in that liquid? Well, there's a few different things, but the two main constituents are oil and water. Now, the water comes from a gland up in the skull called the lacrimal gland. And the oil comes from little glands that run up the inside of the eyelid. They're called meibomian glands. The water is there to lubricate the eye. And the oil is there because the water layer is so thin that it would evaporate immediately. And therefore, we have a thin layer of oil that sits on top of that water and stops it evaporating, or at least stops it evaporating until we blink again. Can you see how all of these things are so interlinked? Each one comes from a different place, and yet they can't function without the other. So we've got lids, eyelids, with just the right tension so that they don't flip inwards. Sometimes, by the way, for those people who've had lid tightening surgery, we have a situation where the eyelids have been made slightly too tight and the eyelid wants to flip inside out. They've got just the right tension so they don't flip over, but just enough tension to make sure that they work as a pumping action to wash over more liquid. And of course, they wash away any dirt or debris from the eye. At this point, I think it's important to mention that there's an extra thing to be grateful for here, because if we were geckos, that's a type of lizard, who don't have eyelids, we'd have to lick our eyelids to keep them moist, like they do. Imagine that. So, I mean, I could go on for hours, and maybe I'll speak about this a little bit more in future weeks. I've only talked about a tiny, tiny, tiny percentage of the unbelievable interconnected processes that are going on in the eye in order so that we can see. Every single morning, we say a blessing, thanking Hashem, thanking God for opening up the eyes of the blind. Pokeach Ivrim. Who are we talking about? We're talking about ourselves. Because when we go to sleep and we close our eyes, who's to say that when we open them up again, we'll be able to see? Who's to say that all those functions will still be performing? We can't take anything for granted. But unfortunately, that particular blessing is like one line in a whole list of things that we say every single morning. And many of us may well rush it without even thinking. So here's the challenge for this week of Hanukkah. To start appreciating our wonderful gifts, especially when the whole point of Hanukkah is to be able to see the lights and remember the miracles that happened to our ancestors. Every day we open two multifaceted gifts with layer upon layer of brilliance. So let's make sure we begin to be truly grateful for them. Thank you everyone for joining me. And I look forward to seeing you next week.